Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Andy Binns. Now, Andy is the co-author, along with his colleagues Charles O'Reilly and Michael Tushman, of the book Corporate Explorer. And it's a book that really does encourage organizations and large organizations to really bring in that entrepreneurial attitude, mindset, skill, everything. And it is a great place. Large organizations are great places to incubate and to develop the businesses of the future. And he would argue that that is a better place than actually in startups, and for reasons that he goes into. But he also talk about how that can impact the organization and how nurturing that entrepreneurial skill is so important in the whole change management of an organization. And I think the other area that we talk about is the generation that we have in organizations, and the challenge that we have with that generation is kind of encouraging them and enticing them into our organizations and then retaining them. And if you have the mentality of the corporate explorer, that certainly does give you an environment whereby you can retain these people for longer than otherwise you might. So it's a great topic, a really, really fascinating topic. And as I say, I think it's a topic that is very, very timely in the current climate that we are in. So I hope you enjoy it. If you're enjoying the podcast, really would love you to give us a good take on iTunes and Spotify and elsewhere, and give us a good review, because that's how we reach more people. And that, at the end of the day, is the object of the exercise. But please, in the meantime, sit back and enjoy the very interesting Andy Binns. Andy, thank you indeed for joining me here on the Winning Teams podcast. It's a great honor to have you.
Thank you very much, John. Really delighted to be here with you.
It'll be good fun. Really want to dig into your book, Corporate Explorer, we'll talk a little bit about, but maybe just to give everybody, there you have it. I'm sure there are one or two for sale. I can see them behind you, actually, if people want to buy.
I can do you a whole load.
So before we get into that, maybe just to give a little bit of context for people, a little bit about your background and your journey to writing the book.
Yeah, so I worked in management consulting, including for McKinsey and Company for a number of years, and then went to join IBM around 2000, and just happened to get assigned to work. I was part of a sort of an internal consulting team. Happened to get to work for the head of strategy of IBM. I think the thinking was, or he worked for McKinsey, surely he'll understand what this guy is on about. And it turned out this man was a visionary. Bruce Harold had a notion that he wanted to create new businesses inside this, at that point, 100 billion revenue behemoth, right? And so he called these emerging businesses, and he engaged some business school professors, Mike Tushman from Harvard, Charles O'Reilly from Stanford, to work with him on this. And I worked with them, helped them, I think, be very successful at that. And then a few years later, Mike, Charles, and I set up a business doing essentially this work. We call it Change Logic. And so I had this sort of incredible moment at IBM, and it's then defined the rest of my professional work. And so that's what I do. I'm clearly British, Welsh, by heritage, but I live in Massachusetts just because that's where the center of the work was when we founded the firm.
Fascinating. I mean, it's. I mean, you mentioned Charles O'Reilly and Michael Tushman there that you set up the business with, and they are your co-authors of Corporate Explorer, and I think it's a really fascinating concept, because your premise is that you don't have to leave corporate life to be an entrepreneur, that you can do that from the inside. And very often that's not how the world sees it. It sees it, you're either an entrepreneur or you're in corporate life, but you're not necessarily, but the two don't necessarily sit terribly well together. And your premise is that's a fallacy.
That's right. And it's something I learned in this experience at IBM. Right, the first corporate explorer I met was this woman, Carol Kovac, who was a scientist by background, and she was given the job, hey, surely we can create a business around the genome being decoded. And so IBM Life Sciences developed into, how do you develop bespoke computing solutions for genetics and proteomics research and so on. And that, of course, then morphed into IBM Watson, and they kind of destroyed it. But at one point, it was a multi-billion-dollar business. And the more we did this, the more I found that there were others who were being successful doing this. And so I'm not going to deny that it's hard. And we'll come on to that, I'm sure. Or that entrepreneurs don't do great work. Of course they do phenomenal work. But it is also true that there really are corporate explorers out there who do build multi-billion-dollar enterprises from inside corporations. And it's just empirically the case. And so then the question becomes, well, how do they do it, and how could others replicate their results?
Yeah. The other thing that I found interesting was that you were saying that, which again, when I read it, it kind of jars a little bit, but I think I get what you mean, but I'll ask you to explore it. Yeah. You say that you maintain that large companies tend to be better places for innovation than a startup. That seems contrary to what everybody will think.
Well, so let me give you an example of why I say that. So one of the companies we talk about in the book is Analog Devices, which is a Massachusetts-based technology firm. Probably now the stock market's fallen, probably now only $75 billion market cap. Right? And they entered the market of condition-based monitoring of machines. So how do you deploy technology to predict when a machine is going to fail, and use this in manufacturing and other kinds of places? It's kind of an emerging area that's been seen as a possibility for a decade, really. But they managed to develop the most advanced solution and build an ecosystem around deploying it using third-party vendors. And they do this with 60 years as a company behind them, with a reputation as a company for absolute reliability and never letting down their customers. And kind of that's part of their sort of their overall reputation value proposition. So not only did they have the technology assets, the financial assets, the leadership assets to lead this, but they also had that reputational, that brand, that reason to play in the market. Now you compare that with a startup. They have none of those things. They could disappear next year. Nobody knows who they are or whether they're better than the other 10 startups with the same domain. And so there's particular reasons why corporations really do have advantages if they can use them. And the analog examples are great.
Yeah. And I want to come back to the point about saying why some companies do it, because there have been stories for a long time and examples of it for a long time where there is a really innovative, creative business that has sprung up and has evolved and developed and grown, has been massively successful, and then the large corporate comes along, says we fancy having some of that, and we bring it in, and then they suck the life out of it, and it fails miserably. So there are loads of stories to highlight that. Right. What is it that the companies that you're talking about are doing that ensure that that doesn't happen, or that they actually foster that spirit and culture of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so the key thing that we see as being key is having an ambition that is equal to the scale of the opportunity or threat of disruption. And so rather than ambition, which is just let's stay where we are, where we've always been doing things we always do, and oh, well, something's new happening, let's just add that to what we do, we'll acquire something, right? Xerox did this. They bought a business outsource processing firm. I can't remember the name of it, American Computer Services, something like that, ACS. And 5 years later, they had to separate because they had no idea what to do with this big acquisition that they made, which is the kind of story you're describing. Acquire things, kill them, or make no sense of them. The firms that set an ambition are saying something quite different. They're saying we actually understand, or we have a hypothesis about where the market's going and what we want to become, right? And they can then make acquisitions in service of that goal, but they also build their own assets or leverage their own assets in service of that goal. So there's a strategic logic to it. There's a reason, there's a rationale. Great example of this is Jensen Huang at the tech firm NVIDIA, right, which was 10 years ago languishing with a share price in the teens of dollars. It was being eliminated by Intel because Intel basically were absorbing their product into the Intel core processor, right? And today their share price has increased by like 8,000%, right? And they did this because the CEO said, we see a possibility to leverage our technology in new markets to do with artificial intelligence, autonomous driving, deep computing, and so on. And this was a deliberate, I want to go here, I see it developing, and what I need you to do, organization, is to bring solutions that that nobody else could do and that only we can do, and we can have fun doing it, right? He had this kind of, and there are others, MasterCard is a great example. Yeah, Ajay Banga, when he was CEO of MasterCard, set this ambition to wage a war on cash, right? He said, I want to eliminate alternatives to our electronic payment system. And he really fired up the organization. I won't go into depth, but that actually increased the market that they were addressing, gave a call to, hey, we need capabilities to do this, right? And so again, it provided this logic and an emotional charge to the organization as well.
But one part is the strategic side to it. And in many cases, when going back to the example I was saying, where the company buys the innovative company, it isn't the strategy that kills it. It's the culture that kills it, right? Sure. Because the strategy can be solid and the logic can be very solid about doing that. But it's the culture of the organization that kill it stone dead. Do you need to have a particular type of culture for this to thrive in? Can you change an old culture in order to allow for this approach that you're talking about?
Yeah. So a couple of things about that, John. I think you've gone straight to the kind of jabbing at the sensitive spot in the pieces, because we know that this is the place that large corporations struggle with most of all, is this kind of set of assumptions and behaviors and practices which are kind of set against change, right? That they, as they become more successful, they develop systems which are working to have them succeed in one business model, right? And when they try to move to a new one, even when they apparently want to make the move, they kill it, right? It's execution failure as much as anything else, right? So the trick to this is partly this ambition question. So you need to have the strategy, yes, but it's also an emotional connection, which I think does signal to the organization, we're moving over here. And importantly, you're a part of it, right? Because one of the reasons why there's this resistance is that innovation often challenges the sort of professional competence or identity of the leaders involved. So, and that's true whether you're electrical engineers, actuaries, pharmaceutical researchers. It doesn't matter where you are. There's kind of a deep professional competence, and many of these disruptive innovations challenge it, right? So there's a great example. My colleague Mike Tushman from Harvard has this case of the French advertising firm Havas, and it tries to make a move from traditional advertising and add to it sort of crowdsource advertising, using the crowd creatives in the crowd to be able to develop campaigns. And he has this video. He went to Paris and talked to all of the leaders of Havas. Never get caught on camera by a Harvard professor. It's kind of like a rule. and they're proud of their new strategy, and the CEO is telling him how brilliant it is and whatever. And then there's two leaders, one in particular, where he gets the camera in front of her, and she says, "This is all nonsense. You know, what could they possibly think? How could they ever replicate the years of training and professional craft that is involved in being a creative in the advertising industry with this digital nonsense," right? And so the point is, this is a visceral, values-based reaction from this professional to the innovation. So what do you do about that? First one is you've got to create something that they can feel a part of, right? And we talk in the book about analog devices doing this by helping to create an identity which is above the one they have, no longer just about components, but is about solving customer problems. So there's ways of reframing the identity. The next thing I think you got to do is don't try to change all the culture at once. I don't think these companies have radically different cultures than any other company. They're better in some ways, worse than others. What they do is they create enough separation for the new ventures to allow them to develop. And these become sort of cultural incubators, right? They teach the old company what the future looks like. And if you can hold it together with this ambition, and you can build a sort of what we describe as a leadership movement around this within the company so they understand it and support it, then you can make this transition to be a company that is both succeeding in the traditional business and exploring into the new. Right? Mm. So it's always about ambition, separate out, succeed in the new, and then integrate.
Yeah. So yeah, sorry, the last bit there. So when you look at that, I mean, you're saying you've got this almost a separate culture in that new entity that you create, or new function, whatever way you want to describe it. But then do you bring that into the organization to affect the change that the organization needs to experience for the future? So is it constantly finding the new, innovating over here, and then integrating so that you affect the change? Is that the model?
It absolutely it is, yes. And part of the danger is not to do that too early, right? Because the risk is that what happens is you get new ventures started, and there's a lot of excitement about them when you're in the early phases, and you say, oh well, now the rest of the business should learn all about that. The trouble is they haven't achieved anything yet. Right?
Yes.
So you need to let them. We talk in the book about ideation, incubation, and scaling. And you can start to expose your new ventures to the rest of the organization when they're in late incubation going into scaling. But if you do it too soon, then all you get is a sort of innovation theater where you're just showing it off rather than really trying to achieve anything.
Yeah, it was interesting. Some of the companies that you talked about, I mean, like Amazon, okay, you expect Amazon to be, agile and innovative because of what it is. But then you talk about organizations like Intel or Bosch, where you don't kind of see necessarily in that same kind of culture box as the likes of Amazon, but they're obviously doing it very successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And one that we talk about in the book, we start the book with this case of my dear friend Christian Kurtis in Hungary. Christian is the manager of the Hungarian business for the European insurance company Unica, and operates in Austria, Switzerland, Eastern Europe, and so on. And this is a very traditional Austrian headquartered, Vienna headquartered company. And Christian sees an opportunity to really reinvent the insurance model. Say, hey, we could actually do this at a radically lower cost, and we could create recreate really the origins of insurance of community and risk sharing within communities. And he creates this additional product called Share Risk. Now, what's interesting here is he proposes this himself and he gets support from it, but he's doing it within this really traditional company, and he benefits from the fact he has a couple of senior sponsors who get it, who are smart enough to respond, and the CEO describes his business proposal as like a nuclear bomb under the industry, right? It's like, and some would say, oh, therefore we shouldn't touch it. But he's smart enough to say, yeah, I'll give you a little bit of money to get started. Right? So my point is that even in the most unlikely traditional businesses, you actually see evidence of this happening and working, because Christian's now scaling this product across Europe.
One of the things I just find interesting as well, and it's to me, it's kind of perhaps a kind of a byproduct, is that the challenge facing, as you well know from the work that you do, the challenge facing many large organizations is both to attract and retain quality staff. Is adopting this approach of entrepreneurship, do you see this as being a really effective way of retaining the high quality staff?
Yeah, John, I think that's a great point, and it's obviously very, of the moment. This great resignation point is something that is really on the minds of all of the CEOs that I talk to, and they are concerned. And what's interesting, and I should say, we don't really know enough about that right now. Right, empirically, it's kind of in motion. Like, why are people leaving? Where are they going? What are they doing? Are they going to come back? But we do know a couple of things. One of them is that in the US, the rate of creation of new businesses has quadrupled at the same time as we have seen a decline, as we've seen people resigning from their jobs in enterprises. And my hypothesis is that at least some number of these people are going off to realize their entrepreneurial ambitions. So why not help them do it inside your corporation? Why let them leave and struggle to succeed, because the odds of startup success are really small, let alone the odds of a unicorn, right? These are tiny numbers of success. So why not help them do it inside and benefit both from whatever value creation that comes from it, but also from retaining them as leaders who are now maybe more committed even to your enterprise. So I can't prove it, but I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if your approach, Andy, going into an organization, and I appreciate they've got to have an idea and a kind of a concept or something that they're looking to create, and you're saying, okay, you're going into this organization maybe quite set in its own way, but the leader, the president, CEO, whatever the title is, has this great ambition and desire to actually do this innovative thing, and he has a couple of people to support. What are the kind of the 3 or 4 things that they must do to make sure that it survives and thrives?
Yeah, this is the corporate explorer themselves.
Yes.
So we see this as, we describe it as really being sort of a two-sided journey for them. On one side, it's about, there are some innovation disciplines to apply. Right? One of the benefits of the last sort of 20 years or so is I think we've got a really good idea about what it takes to build a new venture. You ideate, incubate, and scale this venture, and you use tremendous outside-in customer inquiry, discovery to find out what's the most important customer problems you're going to solve, and then you're going to incubate it with really carefully designed experiments to test and learn your way to an answer, and then you're going to scale it by combining assets from inside and outside the firm. Right? And so if you can master those, you're part of the way along. But the other side of it is you've got to manage change. You've got to realize that you're in a social network, right? And reputation and influence matters as much, if not more, than these questions of how you innovate. And so I would advise, and I do advise corporate explorers to be thinking about, so who are your angels, right? So who are the people who are actually going to be sponsors with sufficient resources to help you get started? Right? Who are your allies? Who are those people who are going to actually pitch in and support you actively? And then who are the advocates? Who are going to retell your story in the corporation and help you to maintain that positive reputation? Because one of the biggest challenges that a corporate explorer has is that corporations are terrible gossips, right? The real gossip engine, right? And
the grapevine is alive and well, isn't it?
Even without the water cooler, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And all it takes is one negative story attached to a project to kill it. And I've seen this happen several times and try to fight hard to help executives see beyond this one negative fact, to say, well, look, you wouldn't kill off an existing business on the basis of this one thing you heard, this one customer failure or this one missed inflation or whatever it was, right? And actually to stay focused on the opportunity. So you've got to manage reputation really carefully in this, and have a tremendous story, right? Have a really clear and compelling story, and keep coming up with stories that you can see through your allies and advocates into the organization, so that you shape the conversation about what you're doing. You don't, become a victim to it. You really maintain that focus on your reputation, which can be exhausting, but it's what it takes. And incidentally, it's not that different from what an entrepreneur has to do. Right? Entrepreneurs also have to engage stakeholders in VC firms and constant rounds of funding and so on, telling a great story. It's just a different type of story, a different context they're going to do it in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just smiling because one of the things that I find when you were talking there, I was thinking this is just stakeholder management. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. And I would always advocate, even leaving outside what we're talking about here, the entrepreneurial role, to anybody in corporate life is to be really good at stakeholder management. Whether that's for your current role or for a future role, but it's a critical piece of their career management. Andy, this is a fascinating topic. And I also think it's a very important topic for this time. So I do think it's hugely valuable, and we could go on and we can talk about it. And what we might do is maybe come back again and dig a bit further into it. But before we wrap up, and you can tell people where they can get in contact with you, 2 questions I ask everybody. One, a book other than your own, I'm sorry to say, that you would recommend or that's had an impact upon you.
Yeah, so this is one that I've been reading very recently, which is Rebecca Henderson's Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And we live in a really troubled world. I mean, with you and I talking the day where Russia's rolling tanks into Ukraine, right? And capitalism has lots of problems, and it needs to attend to its legitimacy. It's because it is the most successful way of organizing human beings and self-organizing to get an outcome. And if we let it go, if we let democracy go, we're really going to struggle to ever it's take a long time to reassert these kinds of principles. So I think Rebecca Henderson does a remarkably good job of articulating what it would take to take on.
Yeah, that's a book I haven't come across before, so I add that to my reading list, which is getting higher as I speak.
Anytime you ask the question.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I'm a sucker for it. So second question is daily rituals, if you have them, what they are and how they serve you.
Yeah, so I have a very strong ritual. I'm up at 6 every morning. I get on the exercise. Well, I go into my wife is a yoga teacher, so we have a small yoga studio in the house, and so I have my yoga, and then I hit my exercise bike, and then I hit my granola and yogurt, and then and read the Guardian even after all these years, and I obviously used to travel a lot, as we all do, but I found that the benefit of this being at home more thing is that I really have managed to keep my ritual going with more intensity than normal.
Yeah, it's hard to keep rituals going when you're traveling, isn't it? I find that too, because when you're traveling, it just I mean, I know that can be a bit of an excuse in some ways, but I think it just does knock out your routines and everything, and it's hard to keep them. But that's a pretty strict regime to have every morning. So well done on that, Andy. This has been fantastic. Where can people reach you? We'll put everything in the notes, but if they're listening, where can they reach you?
So Corporate Explorer, thecorporateexplorer.com, and you can reach me at andrew.bins at Change Logic, as displayed on my company accessories .com.
So you're completely on brand, even in the way you're dressed. Oh my God. As if we should doubt. All
the way through.
Absolutely. Cut you in half, it's there as well. Andy, thank you so much for being a guest. It's been fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I know our audience will get an awful lot from that. I'd highly recommend the book. It's a great read and a book of its time. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.